Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the In Full Bloom Book Club. Here, we utilize the transformative power of storytelling to explore perspectives and to cultivate empathy, compassion, and connection. So, our season theme is collective grief/trauma. And our question for this season is: how does trauma shape us? What consequences of collective trauma are we facing today? How can we support one another in navigating collective grief? So, we are currently reading Riding the Lightning, A Year in the Life of a New York City Paramedic by Anthony Almojera. Physical and digital book purchase options are in the description box below, so go ahead and check that out so you can follow along with us. So, for this episode, we will be discussing chapters 4 through 8. There are lots of spoilers for this episode, so please go ahead and read the chapters and come back and join in the discussion. And also, if you enjoy this kind of content and you value what we're doing here, it means so much to us if you can show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing below. It really helps push forward our channel and reach other people who are also interested in this type of content. As always, we do a quote of the day, and today is Tia's turn to do her quote.
So I'm going to start off by saying I feel like this seems so obnoxious and very extra. Extra, I'm okay with. That's my brand. Obnoxious, I don't try to go for that. But I just felt like it was so fitting. So there's a poem. I promise I can read it really quickly. My quote for today is actually a poem by William Ernest Henley, and it's called Invictus. I may have spoken about it here before. So the poem reads, out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And so essentially, again, I read a whole poem, so I won't be as extensive as I would be otherwise. But yeah, I thought it was fitting, kind of talking about a lot of the uncertainty that the EMS workers were dealing with in this part of the novel. I think it, is fitting because of that, and it kind of speaks to having uncertainty about the future. And also, funny enough, I came across this, or really fell in love with this poem and chose it to put in my bathroom and hang up on the wall during the pandemic. I'm pretty sure at the very beginning. So during this time period that we're talking about, it really spoke to what I was going through in my life. So yeah, thank you all for letting me share.
And now for the summary. In this section of the novel, Almojera and the EMS gear up to no avail for the approaching virus outbreak. In February, as news about the virus outbreak in China are circulating, New Yorkers in Chinatown are celebrating Chinese New Year and standing in solidarity with their friends across the world. Just a month before mandated lockdowns, Almojera testified at City Hall about the unequal treatment EMS workers have received in comparison to other first responders. In the coming months, this issue would prove to be detrimental. In the coming weeks, FDNY sends out memos about how to address the virus if it makes its way to America. Many EMS workers still have no idea of the toll this virus will take, many dismissing it as something that would pass shortly. It did all but that. In March, we read about the onset of the pandemic's impact in New York unfold as Almojera's team tries to desperately cope with the lack of information they have about COVID, paired with the rapid increase of fever/cough calls, a code used to describe people who are suspected to have COVID. Even more, frontline workers lack the necessary equipment to deal with the influx of patients they are receiving. EMS workers, nurses, doctors, they are all overwhelmed. Almojera becomes a face for EMS workers, taking media interviews about the challenges they face during this time, garnering up support from his community by way of supplies and food. Almojera is overwhelmed by the amount of people who aren't making it, and not just because of the virus, but because of medical services' inability to handle the massive number of ill people in the city. In April, though, there is a reprieve from the chaos they experienced in the weeks prior. Little did they know it wouldn't last long. On May 25th, in Minneapolis, the death of George Floyd creates mourning and outrage. The FDNY EMS finds themselves with cops and protesters alike in the back of their ambulance after riots break out in the streets. It looks as though the tension and panic of this season will not let up easy.
So what are you guys' general impressions or thoughts about this section that we read?
So one thing I really thought was interesting about this section is this is when we really get into the nitty-gritty of what the pandemic looked like, what the COVID-19 outbreak looked like. Whereas previously we are just kind of talking about his existence before. So from here on out, we kind of know how it plays out to a certain extent. Obviously, not his particular story, but when the EMS workers are anticipating certain things, or when they kind of have a reprieve from what's going on, we recognize that it will not be long lasting. And so it's really interesting viewing this from that perspective. I also something that kind of came up for me was just a thought about the fragility of the healthcare system. And I'm not speaking specifically about America, but just the reality that this was something that humans built the healthcare system, right? In order to be able to save lives. And you have to have enough workers, you have to have enough resources. And I just think some of these things that we were born into and that are, pre-established, centuries before we were born, we can really take for granted. And just listening to how there were not enough beds, and how overwhelmed some of the doctors and the nurses were getting. One, definitely gave me a sense of gratitude for first responders and for frontline workers and medical staff and everything. The work that they do is incredible. But also just yeah, maybe really reflect on the fact that in the same way that if someone calls out at a restaurant, you know what I mean? If enough nurses called out, no one's getting treated. You know what I mean? But yeah, my I guess general overall impressions of this is just it was definitely jam packed with a lot of emotion. Um, the way the way that March specifically unfolded, um, and the way he speaks about it mirrors I imagine how a lot of people felt about March, because I remember, literally, granted, I will testify to the fact that I am not the best at keeping up with current events and things like that. So I'm sure people were well aware of what was going on overseas in regard to the virus, since December or January. But I heard murmurs of it, but didn't think twice about it until literally the week I was working at school at the time, the week the school was shut down. And then from there it was just kind of whoa, what's going on? And anyways, it's yeah, I appreciate that the way he revealed that information to us, and that it felt like it matched the speed of what was actually going on. I felt the overwhelm that they must have felt in those moments. So.
When I was reading this section, something that really stood out to me is how the attitude went from, oh, this won't last long, we're not worried about it, to, oh, I can tell this is going to be a bad summer. It was just really a different perspective for me to see, because I was in a household and around people that were hyper vigilant. So just to see that mindset and just more about that perspective was really insightful for me, and it helps me have a little bit more empathy for the people who are like, oh, we don't need a mask. But just seeing how, yeah, they may have felt that way initially, but in due time they kind of understood, yeah, this is more serious. So that was really interesting for me to read.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. It was there are moments where I had to remind myself that although this is a story being told, this is also part of our history. Like, this happened. And so you're reading it and you're like, it feels like a drama, you know? But then like you snap and you realize, oh my God, those moments really happened. And like what really made me super emotional was what Tia had mentioned, like the times when the paramedics would get to the hospital and the doctors, there were like two doctors at one point at one of the hospitals they went to, and like she said, please, no more people. And like I've experienced being stressed, you know, you're stressed then, but like never were the stakes were that high, you know? And I couldn't imagine like the level of just you wanting to break. And like I kind of was thinking the whole time, like, what was pushing them? What, you know? And then there was a part of the story where he said, one of the other paramedics, typically she could push through, but there's a point where she was like, I literally can't do this for my mental health. I have to I have to be on desk duty. I can't do this. And that one, commend her for honoring herself, but it's just insane to like relive those stories that happened to people during that time. And then also to get a bird's eye view of how truly the disparity between the privileged and the not so privileged, you know, people who were able to leave and go out and live by the countryside versus those who were living in the cities and were seeing the most death, you know, and just how more, you know, the morgues were backed up, and like that is just insane. And gosh, my heart really like, again, I was reliving all of that, but then again, I like just felt that like that sadness and the anguish for the people who experienced that at, you know, especially in New York, because like you said, New York was hit the hardest. And I just, wow, I was really cool. Like you said, Tia, in the beginning, I remember, you know, how my attitude was around March time. And I remember like there's a part of the story he mentioned where the mayor had said that you don't need to wear masks, you know, everyone's fine. And I remember hearing messages like, you know, people saying that. And I remember exactly like one of the days I was working where I was working at a theater and people came in and they're like, we were just talking about it. And I was like, well, you know, you don't really need to wear masks because, you know, we're fine and everything like that. They were like, you know, downplay. I vividly remember that. And then just to see where we ended up, just it's insane. But such a beautifully written part of the story. I love this part of the story. So yeah.
Our next question. On page 151, Almojera explains that as a lieutenant, if someone dies in the field, it is his responsibility to pronounce the time of death and inform the patient's loved ones. He says, it's a responsibility to bear witness to people's loss, and I consider it a privilege. Let's explore what this communicates about Anthony and how he understands his role.
So first off, I wrote a couple things down, but first off, losing someone is like one of the hardest things, or maybe the hardest thing we ever have to endure in our lifetime, because it's permanent, and obviously we build a connection to the people that are in our lives, and so hearing that news is never going to be an easy thing for anybody, no matter what. But I think it's incredible that because of a culmination of like him having the skill set and the education and, you know, the experience to one, determine death, you know, to be able to be like, there's nothing else we can do for this person. He obviously has the experience and people trust him to do that, to make that final call, you know? And so I just think on a personal and a professional level, he's able to handle that interaction. And that takes a lot to say that you are the person we want to be face to face with these people who are about to hear the worst news possible. And we believe that you can, one, determine that that is the news that you have to deliver, but also two, handle what that conversation will look like. Obviously, throughout the story, we get to know him a little better. And we can tell that, one, he sees the value of this type of responsibility. And he shows a great deal of respect for what he does. it's the way he's interacting with them, which is something that I've been paying close attention to. I think a lot of times when we have to deliver really hard truths to people, we're sometimes consumed by what their reaction's going to be and how we're going to respond to that versus them genuinely just receiving that news and how to kind of be there for that person. You know, how, yeah, just what they're feeling. It's almost in a selfish way we kind of are in that interaction. But for him, I imagine he knows that it's not about him. It's not about how he feels about how they react. It's genuinely just about delivering this news and being there for that person. He can completely strip away all of his own biases and everything else. At the end of the day, this is another human being that you have to communicate something very difficult to. And it just speaks to his emotional maturity, his dedication to his craft, to his fellow man, you know?
Yeah, thank you, Asia. Like certainly, as you were saying, like what a responsibility for him to hold. During the pandemic, it also became a matter of how many times are we going to try to revive this person, and how much, if it's kind of a risk assessment for each individual, like if we're spending more time on this individual, it's less time we can be spending on the, you know, thousands of maybe it wasn't thousands, I can't remember. More like hundreds maybe. The tons of calls that are coming in. And so it was also a matter of having to stand firm in the fact that we're not going to try anymore. You know what I mean? Maybe after, we're determining the probability of this individual being revived and deciding accordingly, like whether we want to continue trying. And that's a really difficult thing, I can imagine, to be able to choose the greater good over this one individual's life. I mean, to come to that understanding and to be able to settle into and make peace with that decision is difficult enough. But to be able to communicate that to the family, is, devastating. One thing that I definitely thought this communicated about Anthony, was kind of this intersection between the material and the spiritual world. So, obviously that's his responsibility as a lieutenant, like that's the role he's been assigned. But the way he talks about it, bearing witness to this, to their loss, it felt like he held it not only as a responsibility, like a list of things he has to do as a lieutenant, but like it was a spiritual responsibility, like a human responsibility. Um, that there's no separation between like how he identifies himself as a person, as a human, and how he identifies himself in that role. And I really relate to that. Obviously, I'm not comparing myself to the work that he's doing, but I can resonate with kind of that lack of separation between the material world and the spiritual world. Um, and it had me thinking about, so I work with Crisis Text Line, which is actually one of the charities that we're supporting this season. You also, if you're interested, definitely check the description box. But yeah, I've volunteered for a little while now with Crisis Text Line, and I was just having a conversation with someone the other day. They provide services, for context. They provide um, crisis like chat support, through SMS message and also through different messaging apps and things like that. They provide support to people who are in mental health crisis. And so, you're not helping people navigate through really difficult situations, mental health wise, sometimes even like suicidal ideation, sometimes self harm. And there is kind of a sacredness to being there when people are experiencing that level of pain. And I don't mean to like romanticize like people's pain, um, but there's something so human about witnessing that and holding space for that. I was also thinking about how like when funeral cars come through, like the lineup of funeral cars, like I've seen people like walking, like take off their hat as a sign of respect. And I've seen like a whole bunch of people around me do that. And there's something so, again, so like humbling and so human about or I don't know, so grounding about death and grief and like witnessing other people experience that. I think it takes us outside of kind of the hecticness of daily life sometimes and really grounds us in like what matters to us most and what connects us. Like everyone everyone can imagine the heaviness of losing someone. You know what I mean? And I think there's a certain just sense of reverence for that experience. And I also think that's kind of communicated through this quote.
Yeah, and like I definitely agree with everything that you guys have been saying, but I didn't consider like the spiritual element to it. And I feel like people will stop what they're doing to pay reverence because I like in that moment, like you have to reckon with the fact that your time is coming. Like nobody gets out of this planet alive. But just to go back to the question, I feel like it shows Anthony's not only like technical understanding of his job description, but his emotional competency. And I think it's really amazing that despite the fact that he's seeing death all the time and seeing so many patients, still has the sensitivity, the case sensitivity to recognize like this was somebody to someone, or this is just somebody. Like, I think it just shows that he would never just see people as a number. And he's like a deeply empathetic person and lieutenant. And then the part about him saying that he considers it a privilege, I just, I was a little stuck on that part. And I don't know if anybody has any insight on like how you interpreted that, but that really stood out to me too. He doesn't say like, oh, it's a burden, or, I can't do it. I hate doing this part. So did anybody have like any insight on the way that he considers it a privilege to be that bearer of bad news?
So I kind of sat with it at first. I agree, Elena. I was kind of like thrown when he said privilege, but kind of through inference and figuring out who Anthony is, to be in that space with another human being who is going to be grieving something like that, a loss. Um, you are a part of a very big moment in their lives. And not everyone has that opportunity. And although this is a very sad moment, it is also a moment where you need somebody. That is one of the greatest moments where you really need another human being to connect with you. And so that's a privilege. That's a privilege to be able to be with someone at their most vulnerable, but also be able to handle them at their most vulnerable, you know? So I think just personally, that's kind of how I interpreted what he meant by it being a privilege. All right. So before we jump into our second question, we like to just remind you all to, if you are liking what you're seeing and hearing, and you are a supporter of everything we're trying to do here, please go ahead and like this video right now. So just pause the video, like, and also share in the comments if you have any responses to any of the questions we've already, the questions we have so far. If you want to share your thoughts about this section, please go ahead and do so. And subscribe to go ahead and get notified whenever we're posting more videos so you can follow along with us, okay? All right, so on to the second question. Question 2 reads, in chapter 8, Almojera talks about the fear that consumed everyone at the onset of the pandemic. He describes the lengths people would go to try to avoid the virus. In your experience, what role does fear play in collective tragedy, grief, and trauma?
As far as trauma, I just noted that fear can really change your perspective of the world, and can change how you relate to the world as a result, can create a hypervigilance, and that's often something that's noted when it comes to trauma, when people are talking about like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. I mean, I really, at least I know in the moment, when you're going through something that frightening, you know, your cortisol levels rise, to try to create like that fight or flight response and to try to keep you, safe. And from my understanding, that can kind of be there's kind of permanent damage is not quite the word that I want to use. But your biology can be permanently impacted, or at least if not permanently impacted, when you are exposed to certain triggers, you can have specific responses that are um, that happen as a result of kind of the trauma that you faced. And so I hope that makes sense. um, so yeah, I was actually talking to someone once, and this particular individual, they were kind of talking about some of the anxieties they have about situations. And I'm very much I tend to be very much a logic, like, and statistics girl. And so I was kind of like, statistically speaking, like, this is not likely to have, you know what I mean? It was interesting because it felt like their fear almost felt like childlike to me in a way. Like, because I remember as a kid, y'all can probably relate, like, certain things I was so worried about, like obscure things that I was like legitimately felt like I need to prepare my life for it. And it was like the now as an adult, I know the likelihood of me running across that, it's not even worth it to consider, you know what I mean? But at the time it seemed like this is so likely to happen. I remember I was talking to this person. It just seemed like, I just was trying to make sense of like why this was such a fear for them. But they kind of, were talking to me about some of the experiences they had. Um, and we kind of settle on the fact that some of the trauma they had experienced felt like an anomaly, right? Statistically, it was the anomaly. It was not likely to happen, or people would never have imagined, even maybe not so much statistically, or even if it wasn't statistically an anomaly, people would have never expected this to happen, right? Um, but it did. And so for them, whereas I kind of have the privilege of always viewing things from a fact-based statistical framework, in their mind, if that could happen to me, anything could happen to me, right? And so it was so interesting how that really changed their relationship with fear and with anxiety and with, with like daily occurrences. I was even thinking of kind of how um from a collective standpoint, how the world that we live in today, the constant influx of media that we know what's going on all around the world, or we can access what's going on all around the world all the time, right? And so all the kidnappings that happen, all the, assaults that happen, we have access to. And I think about, like, when I talk to people who maybe grew up in the 70s, when I talk to them about kind of how they grew up and the agency that their parents gave them at a really young age, I'm thinking like I could never if I had a child, you know what I mean? And my mom didn't like raise me with that level of agency. Um, and I wonder how much of that is kind of a collective trauma, like as we were starting to see more and more what happened in the world, or I don't know if like crime rates were actually rising, or if it's just like as a result of us again having more information about what's happening out there. But I think we experience a sort of collective trauma, and that we have like this fear, and now parents are not, parents are uh, perceiving the world differently, and as a result managing their children and what they do differently. So yeah, those are all the things that came up for me.
I think when I think about how I would like answer this question, I feel like in tragedy, grief, and trauma, fear can like instill a sense of powerlessness. And so observed that people tend to look for an individual or groups of people to like blame, to kind of feel like they have a grasp on something. So just like in a case like Pearl Harbor, when they decided to put Japanese people in internment camps as like a scapegoat, or 9/11 when Muslims were facing a lot of xenophobia. And then in a case like COVID-19, where it wasn't an event, but it was like tragedy unfolding over years, we saw reports of like Asian hate crimes increasing. And so I've just found that fear plays the role of unifying people to a group or people, but also like dividing people based on like, okay, so what do we do now when it's time to like organize or figure out how to fix the problem? Then there's like division caused. So on one hand, you have, oh, these are the people that are the enemy in the situation. And then when we try to do like solution based, it becomes divisive. Like in the pandemic, oh, I'm not wearing a mask. You should wear a mask, or I'm not vaccinated, or you need to get vaccinated. It was like new things to disagree on, kind of. And I think all of the little pop-up issues that we saw were stemming from fear, I think.
I love that point about power and the fact that like gravitating toward these certain groups and having a other, like an enemy that can be seen and understood, to face, can, I think, give people a certain sense of agency. And it makes sense to me that people would have a tendency to do that in those cases. Thank you for noting that.
Hey Tribe, before you go, we wanted to chat with you about how you can help your fellow humans navigate collective grief and trauma. This season, each host has chosen a charity to share with you all. The charities we've selected have missions that address collective grief or trauma in some way. Our hope is that you'll find a charity whose mission aligns with your hopes for humanity.
You can check the description box for links to our fundraising pages. We encourage you all to explore the websites for information about each organization's impact and ensure you're making an informed decision when giving. Info Blue Media has no affiliation with any of these charities or crowdfunding platforms. Thank you all for your consideration.
Journey well.